The year was 1947. Hollywood stood as a beacon of hope, its golden age in full swing. The streets shimmered with ambition. Movie premieres at Grauman's Chinese Theater, jazz clubs filled with cigarette smoke and laughter, and hopeful dreamers arriving each day, their eyes wide with possibility. The City of Angels, they called it, where fame and fortune were just a screen test away. But for every star that found their place in the firmament, countless others faded into obscurity, their dreams swallowed by the unrelenting pulse of the city. Elizabeth Short was one of those dreamers. Young, beautiful, and full of hope, she came to Los Angeles seeking the promise of a brighter future. Born in Boston in 1924, her life had already been shaped by hardship. Her father's disappearance during the Great Depression, the struggles of a single mother raising 5 daughters, and the restlessness that led Elizabeth to travel between cities, searching for a place to belong. With striking features and a smile that hinted at a quiet longing, she fit the mold of Hollywood's endless parade of starlets, each hoping to be the next Veronica Lake or Rita Hayworth. To those who knew her, Elizabeth carried an air of mystery. She was charming yet elusive, a young woman whose life intersected with many, yet seemed to truly belong to no one. She drifted through the post-war landscape from Massachusetts to Florida, from California to Chicago, always returning to the city where dreams were made. Her letters home were filled with optimism, telling of casting calls and possibilities, of an ever-elusive break just beyond her grasp. But Hollywood was a city of contrasts. The same streets that saw champagne toasts and flashbulbs also bore the weight of whispered secrets. The glamour had its shadows, and the hopeful often found themselves lost in its corridors. In January of 1947, Elizabeth Short's name would be etched into history, but not as the rising star she had envisioned. Instead, she would be remembered for something far more haunting. A mystery that would grip the nation for decades to come. Her murder was unlike anything Los Angeles had seen before. The brutality of it stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Newspapers seized upon the grisly details, and almost overnight, Elizabeth Short was transformed from an anonymous young woman into an icon of tragedy. The city, so accustomed to spinning tales of fame and fortune, found itself entangled in a real-life horror story, one that remains unsolved to this day. What happens when dreams meet a fate no one could have imagined? How did a young woman with hopes of stardom become a name forever linked to one of the most infamous cold cases in American history? This is the story of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. Los Angeles, 1947. A city emerging from the shadows of war, standing as a beacon of hope for those who sought a better life. The streets were alive with the dreams of countless men and women hoping to strike it rich, or carve a name for themselves in a town that promised fame, fortune, and reinvention. The remnants of the Second World War were still being felt in the air, the scars of the conflict lingering in the hearts of those who had returned home. Amid the bustling city, the dreams of many were constantly clashing with the reality of the struggle to survive. It was a time when hope and despair coexisted in a delicate balance, and those who could weather the storm were the ones who thrived in a city that seemed to both embrace and chew up its inhabitants. For Elizabeth Short, Los Angeles was more than just a city. It was a lifeline, a place where the rags of her past could be discarded in favor of something far grander. Born in Medford, Massachusetts in 1924, Elizabeth's life had been marked by both tragedy and perseverance. As a child, she had suffered the loss of her father, whose disappearance left her family in financial ruin. The harsh realities of life took root early, and she was no stranger to hardship. Yet, Elizabeth's beauty and charm led her to dream of a different life, one that promised fame, adoration, and the allure of the silver screen. Her eyes were filled with visions of herself as a Hollywood star, dancing under the spotlight, her name in bright lights, alongside the legends she admired. However, this dream seemed to be slipping further away as Elizabeth moved to Los Angeles in 1943, hoping to fulfill her aspirations. She worked as a waitress in a local diner, scraping by while always yearning for a shot at the big time, but the opportunities never quite materialized. Elizabeth appeared in a few small roles, but none brought her the recognition she so desperately craved. Instead, she found herself in a city full of people who shared the same dreams, but were caught in the same grind of waiting for their big break that never came. Elizabeth had few close friends in Los Angeles, and her beauty, though striking, did not shield her from the struggles of isolation and disappointment. Despite the allure of the city, there was always a sense of uncertainty. Hollywood was not the glamorous world it appeared to be on the screen. Beneath the surface, the city was steeped in a web of corruption, crime, and vice. The streets that pulsed with the rhythm of movie premieres and glitzy parties were also home to those who lived on the margins, people whose stories were rarely told, their lives discarded by a society that moved on without a second glance. In the darker corners of the city, where the bright lights of stardom didn't reach, the most sinister acts were hidden beneath a thin veil of civility. On January 15, 1947, in the heart of this city, Elizabeth Short's life would take an irreversible turn, forever transforming her into a figure far more famous in death than she ever was in life. The city that had promised her everything would become the backdrop to one of its most brutal and puzzling crimes, a murder that would haunt Los Angeles for decades. It was on this day that her mutilated body was found, discarded like garbage in a vacant lot near Leimert Park. The body, severed at the waist and drained of blood, presented a scene of unimaginable horror. The brutality of the act would become the centerpiece of one of the most infamous cold cases in American history. The discovery of Elizabeth's body would ignite a media frenzy. The press, hungry for a story, quickly christened her the Black Dahlia, a name drawn from the dark-haired, mysterious beauty she had become. The nickname was a nod to the popular 1946 film The Blue Dahlia, a noir thriller about a woman with a tragic fate. But unlike the fictional character in the movie, Elizabeth's story would not be one of redemption. Instead, it would be shrouded in uncertainty, confusion, and unanswered questions. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, the investigation into Elizabeth Short's death would unfold with a speed and intensity that was to be expected in a city where crime was often overshadowed by the fame of its residents. The police quickly sought answers, but every lead seemed to fizzle out. Every confession fell apart under scrutiny, and every suspect had a story that didn't quite add up. The brutality of the crime and the bizarre circumstances surrounding it only fueled the public's thirst for answers, with every new detail revealed by the media further entrenching the mystery in the public consciousness. Among the key figures in the investigation was Red Manley, a traveling salesman who had been one of the last people to see Elizabeth alive. He had given her a ride a few days before her death, and though he was initially suspected of being involved in her murder, he was later cleared of any wrongdoing. Then there was Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy and eccentric physician whose name would later resurface decades after the murder. His own son, Steve Hodel, would make chilling accusations that his father was involved in the crime. The theories and suspicions surrounding George Hodel would grow into a complex narrative, with some believing that he had ties to the crime long before the police even knew his name. Meanwhile, the role of Dr. Frederick Newbar, the coroner who performed Elizabeth's autopsy, would prove to be pivotal. The details of the autopsy revealed a gruesome reality. The manner in which Elizabeth was killed suggested a level of cruelty that was difficult to comprehend. Her body had been drained of blood, and the precision of the mutilation seemed calculated, pointing to someone with medical knowledge, but the search for the person responsible for her death would drag on for years, with no solid leads or answers. The police department, overwhelmed by a backlog of unsolved cases, would struggle to bring justice to Elizabeth, and the public's appetite for resolution would only grow stronger with each passing year. Elizabeth Short's life, marked by dreams of stardom and a deep yearning for a better life, had been cut tragically short. The haunting image of her face, frozen in time, would live on in the collective memory of a city that could never forget the mystery of her death. And as Los Angeles continued to grow, its streets bustling with new faces and endless possibilities, the case of the Black Dahlia would remain one of the city's most perplexing and enduring mysteries. A story of a woman whose life, aspirations, and death would forever be bound to the dark heart of Hollywood. The days leading up to Elizabeth Short's murder are shrouded in uncertainty. The last known traces of her life were the fleeting encounters with a handful of men, some strangers, some acquaintances, and the promise that her dreams might still come true. But as the clock ticked down to January 15, 1947, there is a chilling sense that Elizabeth's life was about to be snuffed out, as though the very breath of her future had been stolen in an instant. It's hard to say exactly what happened to Elizabeth in those final days, but the pieces of the puzzle hint at a story filled with more questions than answers. Was she abducted? Did she willingly meet someone only to be caught in a trap she could not escape? The details surrounding her disappearance are hauntingly sparse. Some reports suggest that Elizabeth was last seen at the Biltmore Hotel, an opulent landmark that had once been the center of Los Angeles social life. Other accounts place her near a downtown bus station, but in truth, no one knows for certain how she ended up alone in the hours before her brutal murder. What is clear, however, is that her abduction was followed by days of torment. The nature of the crime suggests a level of violence and precision that goes beyond what one might expect from a random act of rage. The killer didn't just take Elizabeth's life. They took it in a manner that left a lasting scar on the city's psyche. And with each new detail, a chilling theory emerges. The killer may have had accomplices. Someone who helped in the planning, or perhaps someone who stood by, watching as Elizabeth endured unspeakable pain. The idea that a single person could have orchestrated such a heinous act is terrifying, but the level of control over the crime scene suggests that there was more than one hand involved. Then, on January 15, 1947, Elizabeth Short's lifeless body was discovered in a vacant lot near Leimert Park, a residential neighborhood in South Los Angeles. The body was found by a mother and child who were walking through the area when they spotted what appeared to be a mannequin. They approached, only to find that the body was real, horribly real. What the world would later come to know was an image of unimaginable horror. A young woman's body severed at the waist, her blood completely drained. The crime scene was a grotesque tableau, meticulously arranged as though the murderer was sending a message, or perhaps trying to create an impression of horror for the public to unravel. The body was posed, legs spread wide apart, arms outstretched as if to give a final, terrifying embrace to a world that would never know her true story. The fact that the body had been carefully drained of blood and left to decompose in the open air suggested a level of calculation and planning. This wasn't a crime of passion, but one that seemed meticulously staged, almost surgical in its execution. The precision of the mutilation would later point to someone with medical knowledge. The cuts were sharp, clean, almost too precise to be the work of a typical criminal. Was this a random act of violence, or was the killer someone who understood the human body, its anatomy, its weaknesses? The way the body had been arranged, with the severed torso placed strategically, echoed a disturbing sense of control. It was as if Elizabeth Short's final moments were meant to serve as an artist's canvas, with her suffering being captured in a way that defied conventional understanding. The investigation, when it finally began, was marred by chaos. The police, overwhelmed by the gruesome nature of the discovery, reacted in haste. The scene was compromised almost immediately, as news of the murder leaked to the press before law enforcement could even cordon off the area. Reporters descended on the scene like vultures, snapping photos and speculating about the identity of the killer. Within hours, the public was bombarded with grisly details, the press eager to stoke fear and capitalize on the shock of the moment. The press's insatiable appetite for information about the crime led to multiple missteps, with details leaking that would later hinder the investigation. The crime scene itself became a circus of misinformation as the police scrambled to maintain control over the investigation. The sensationalism surrounding the case only deepened the hysteria. Graphic images of Elizabeth's body were splashed across newspapers, and the public was drawn into the mystery. Who would commit such an act? Why Elizabeth? And most chillingly, who was capable of such calculated cruelty? It was a question that would consume Los Angeles for decades to come. As the police pieced together the grim evidence, the true scope of the investigation began to take shape. Local children playing near the vacant lot were the first to find Elizabeth's body, unknowingly stumbling upon a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The initial response from law enforcement was disorganized, with officers unable to make sense of the crime. In the rush to investigate, vital clues were lost, and evidence was mishandled. Fingerprints found at the scene were either overlooked or ignored, a misstep that would come to symbolize the broader failures of the LAPD in this case. Dr. Frederick Newbar, the coroner who performed Elizabeth Short's autopsy, revealed disturbing details about the manner in which she had died. The mutilations were not just acts of random violence, they were deliberate, calculated. There were signs of prolonged torture, and the absence of blood suggested that the killer had taken precautions to avoid detection. Dr. Newbar's report confirmed that Elizabeth had been subjected to unimaginable pain before her life was taken, and the meticulousness of the act raised more questions about the identity of the killer. The more the authorities uncovered, the more the case seemed to slip further out of their grasp. Red Manley, one of the men who had been seen with Elizabeth shortly before her disappearance, was one of the first suspects. A traveling salesman who had given Elizabeth a ride just days before her death, Manley was interrogated, but his alibi held up, and he passed a polygraph test. He was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. Other men were considered as suspects. Leslie Dillon, a bellhop with an interest in crime psychology, whose strange behavior raised suspicions but whose connection to the crime remained tenuous at best. But as the months and years dragged on, the case seemed to stall, and new names emerged. In the 1950s, a more chilling theory began to take shape. Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy and eccentric physician, was linked to the crime, not through direct evidence, but through a trail of circumstantial connections. His own son, Steve Hodel, would later claim that his father had been involved in Elizabeth Short's murder. Evidence, both circumstantial and psychological, would later tie Hodel to the crime. But even as theories emerged, the case remained unsolved, the questions unresolved. Elizabeth Short's murder would never lose its grip on Los Angeles. The images of her mutilated body, the fractured investigation, and the speculation that followed would continue to haunt the city's history, always lingering in the background as one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in America. The story of the Black Dahlia would remain, a dark and twisted tale that Los Angeles, in all its grandeur, could never quite escape. The impact of Elizabeth Short's death reverberated far beyond the dark alleyways and empty streets of Los Angeles. Her murder, the brutality of which still echoes through the decades, set off a chain reaction that would be felt across the country. For Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, the grief was compounded not only by the loss of her daughter, but by the crushing frustration of never seeing justice served. The brutality of her daughter's death haunted her every waking moment, but the uncertainty, the unanswered questions, were perhaps the heaviest burden to bear. The investigation that had begun with such urgency faltered under its own weight, leaving the Short family in a state of unrelenting anguish. Phoebe, in particular, became a symbol of heartbreak. A mother searching for answers in a world that seemed to have forgotten her daughter. The lack of closure was a wound that never healed. The sense of helplessness that came from seeing the case fizzle into obscurity was a bitterness Phoebe would carry with her until her death. Her grief was not just personal, it mirrored the frustration of a community that felt abandoned by the very systems designed to protect them. Los Angeles, with its towering buildings and bright lights, was a city that prided itself on its ability to solve crimes, but Elizabeth's murder remained a shadow, an unresolved chapter in its history. For the community at large, the Black Dahlia case was a source of fear and uncertainty. The streets of Los Angeles, so full of life and promise, seemed more dangerous now. The murder had exposed a vulnerability that many hadn't considered, the idea that anyone could be next. People began to question their own safety as fear crept into everyday conversations. The police, once seen as protectors, now seemed ineffective, overwhelmed by the case's complexity and haunted by their own missteps. Distrust of law enforcement grew as citizens wondered why the investigation had stalled, why clues had been ignored, and why the killer had never been brought to justice. The mystery of Elizabeth Short's death continued to loom large, leaving a cloud of doubt over those entrusted with protecting the city. The media, too, had its role in amplifying the fear and speculation. As the case unfolded, the press seized upon it with a ferocity that mirrored the public's hunger for answers. Newspapers splashed graphic details of the crime across their front pages, and magazines ran sensationalized stories that further deepened the mystery. Elizabeth's life, reduced to the label of the Black Dahlia, was twisted into a story for the masses, a story that barely resembled the real woman she had been. The relentless media attention became a double-edged sword. It kept the case in the public eye, but also sensationalized her death, stripping her of her dignity and reducing her memory to that of a crime victim. Yet the case's grip on the media didn't fade. It was as though the nation had collectively latched onto the enigma of Elizabeth Short's death, creating theories, writing books, and making films, all in an attempt to solve a puzzle that, to this day, remains unsolved. Modern perspectives on the case only fuel this ongoing obsession. Theories continue to emerge, some suggesting that police corruption or incompetence played a role, while others focus on the idea that a wealthy, influential person may have been involved. There are those who argue that the LAPD's failure to solve the case was a reflection of systemic issues, both in the police force and in society. But amidst all the theories and speculations, one truth remains clear. Elizabeth Short's life and death have become a symbol of the countless untold stories, the forgotten victims who slipped through the cracks of a society more focused on spectacle than substance. The fallout from this case is not merely a matter of police blunders or media frenzy. It speaks to larger societal issues that have long been ignored, issues of gender, vulnerability, and systemic failures in addressing crime. The media's portrayal of Elizabeth Short was steeped in sexism, as her death was often reduced to sensational headlines and lurid details about her appearance and perceived promiscuity. It was as though her beauty and desire for fame were enough to justify the violence she endured. This pattern of victim blaming, where the woman becomes the focus of her own murder, is far too common in media portrayals of crime, especially when the victim is a woman. Elizabeth Short, like so many others, became a cautionary tale in a world where women's lives were often undervalued, their suffering overlooked. Moreover, the investigation itself exposed the flaws within the LAPD. The mismanagement of evidence, the public leaks to the press, and the failure to pursue meaningful leads only compounded the tragedy. The fact that Elizabeth's murder remains unsolved speaks to the systemic inefficiencies of the police force at the time. The case highlighted the need for better resources, better training, and a more thoughtful approach to solving violent crimes. But Elizabeth's death was also a reminder that there are far too many vulnerable individuals like her, people who fall through the cracks, whose lives are overlooked until they become victims of unspeakable acts. As we reflect on Elizabeth Short's case, we must acknowledge the deep lessons it imparts. Her story is a reminder of the importance of paying attention to the signs of abuse, exploitation, and the vulnerability that many individuals face. In a world where so many are marginalized, where so many lives are reduced to mere statistics or headlines, we must ask ourselves, what are we doing to protect the most vulnerable among us? Elizabeth Short's story is not just one of murder. It is a reminder of the broader societal failures that allowed such a tragedy to unfold. The tragedy of Elizabeth Short's death and the mystery that followed is a painful lesson in the fragility of life and the importance of safeguarding those at risk. Her story calls us to recognize the warning signs of exploitation and abuse before it is too late. It implores us to speak out against injustice and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. As we remember her, we must honor her life, not just the life of a victim, but the life of a young woman with dreams, aspirations, and a future that was taken far too soon. Elizabeth Short may have been silenced, but her story is far from over. It reminds us that justice delayed is justice denied, and that we must continue to fight for the voiceless, for those who are left behind. The Black Dahlia's legacy is not just a murder unsolved, but a call to action for all of us, to do better, to be better, and to ensure that no more lives are lost to indifference. Her dream may have been taken from her, but we can still make sure her story serves as a beacon for those who seek justice, for those who cannot speak for themselves, and for a society that cannot afford to turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. Let us remember Elizabeth Short, not as a symbol of a crime gone unsolved, but as a reminder of the power we have to make things right. Her story may have ended tragically, but its lessons remain, and in those lessons, we find the strength to stand up for what is right and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves.